have just gotten a little pop-out notification to alert you of that. If you do not want to be part of the recording, you can always turn off your video. Next, I know there is a lot of questions on this topic, so please drop them in the chat throughout the course of our presentations. We are going to have time at the end for a robust discussion. So as things come up, please drop them in the chat. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Lizzie Wyan to kick things off.
Thanks so much, Kasha, and welcome all of you. I always love to see this many people interested in the really amazing and interesting research that we get to do every day at MAPC. I am Lizzie Wyan. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at MAPC, and we are your regional planning agency serving the 101 cities and towns of Metropolitan Boston. I am very excited to be able to put on this webinar today because it actually is about a body of research that is near and dear to my heart. And this work has been generously supported by the Barr Foundation and Transportation for Massachusetts, which is also co-sponsoring this event. And we are really looking at sort of what is the future of work as we start to move towards recovery in what feels like an ongoing and endless pandemic. And I'll say, you know, this is a set of questions that we actually started asking pretty early on in the pandemic. And honestly, some of the questions that we were thinking about even predated the start of COVID, because we were starting to really think about how our region was changing and how people were starting to actually move into more remote work. And that was before every single person saw all of their colleagues in like little Brady Bunch squares on their screen every day. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Conor Gately. And Conor is going to walk us through some of the work that we have done at MAPC. And then we are also going to have an opportunity to hear from Scott Mullen at Better City and Jared Johnson at Transit Matters. And then we'll have a panel conversation and have an opportunity for questions from all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Conor.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thanks everyone for joining us. Let me just get my PowerPoint up here. My name is Conor Gately. I am a land use and transportation planner at MAPC. Let's go full screen. And I'm going to talk, you know, like Lizzie said, we've been thinking about this a lot, even pre-COVID. We've obviously been thinking about this a lot over the last, you know, year and a half, pushing on towards 2 years. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the things we've been thinking about, some of the data and analysis we've preliminarily been doing, and kind of outline, you know, our thought process about what we know now and what we sort of have known about telework leading up to now, and then touch on some of the things that we're concerned about and what we think we need to be doing in terms of data gathering, analysis, to make good decisions, and in particular, what actions can we be taking now, as well as, you know, the situation continues to evolve, to kind of create the region that we want to see and to try to address, you know, pre-existing and ongoing inequities, you know, and try to make sure that we can use to some extent this moment to try to, you know, create the sustainable housing opportunities, employment opportunities, and transportation systems that we want to see in the region. So, you know, prior to COVID, teleworking, remote working, you know, there's a lot of words for it, had been growing. It's been growing nationwide rapidly from, you know, the past couple of decades, and in the MAPC region, somewhere around, you know, 5%, a little 5.5% of workers were teleworking or remote working most of the time, as a sort of the majority of their form of, quote, commuting was, you know, was to do it remotely. And the American Community Survey is one of our great sources of data on this, but it is somewhat limited in kind of how we visualize, how we conceive of teleworking now, in that it really only was picking up people who were sort of full-time or most of the time teleworkers. And this map just kind of shows where they are, where they were. This not what the map looks like today. And we could see that, you know, it was mostly sort of relatively speaking in some of the outer suburbs, further out North and South Shore. Obviously right now that these numbers look different, and potentially these patterns will look different post-pandemic, as we expect many more people than 5.5% of the regional workforce to be teleworking to some extent come whenever the end of this pandemic arrives for us. So nationally, we were a bit above, the national average of about 3.5%. And like I said, this has been growing substantially over the last couple of decades. And in addition, there's been this substantial increase in, the number of people who, I'm just going to hide my little panel there. Okay. The number of people who, express interest in teleworking or part-time remote working as a benefit. 80% of employees expressed interest pre-COVID in wanting some form of part-time teleworking. A third of employees expressed, an interest in changing jobs for the opportunity to have a remote work benefit. And as high as a quarter of workers expressed an interest in taking as much as a 10% pay cut to work remotely. So this sort of demand for this, teleworking as a benefit was already there pre-COVID. And then obviously we're now kind of coping with how are we going to return from a forced, massive deployment across a variety of our industries of teleworking and remote working. So this is a series of data points from the census, the household pulse survey, which asked about the percentage of adults in households where at least one adult was teleworking because of the coronavirus pandemic. And so that first bar there in the middle, March 2021, had it at about 52% for the region of adults were in households with at least one adult teleworking. And that's sort of where we were throughout all of 2020 as well. Throughout the lockdowns, that's sort of where we maxed out kind of as a broader urbanized area. And then, with the vaccination campaigns rolling out in the spring and the summer, we sort of have seen that number drop down into the sort of high 30%, low 40%, where it's sort of been stuck into the fall, largely we assume because, the Delta variant and so on has sort of thrown a wrench in what I think were a lot of reopening plans and a lot of return to work plans. Certainly that's, what happened at our agency as well. So that's sort of where we are now. Some of the expectations that we've been thinking about, both on the employee side and the employer side, have come from a variety of surveys. Scott Mullen is going to talk to us more about surveys that he's been doing with A Better City. Something we found very interesting was some of the perspectives from employers, and this is the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership Survey, done again earlier this summer. So sort of, on the highs of a vaccination campaign that seemed to be rolling out very well in the state, and pre, Delta variant kind of throwing a wrench in things. And the expectations from these companies were, they were thinking on the order of, a third of their employees post-pandemic were going to be fully or mostly remote, compared to 6%. And so these were employers, surveyed across the region, out past 495 as well. So, a sample of a workforce where pre-COVID there was a very modest amount of teleworking going on. During COVID, that number shot up very high. So these are, employers where the possibility for remote work was a large share of their workforce, and this is their expectation for what comes next on the right. And if you add up the yellow and the orange and the purple, which includes both full-time, most of the time, and occasional, you see that we're looking at potentially 50% or more of some of these companies having their workforce working remotely at some amount of the week. And that amount, it's going to vary. It seems like a lot of people are talking about 1 to 3 days a week. Somewhere in there is what they're expecting, for people to either be remote or in the office. And importantly, this is probably going to have implications for how the timing of, the days that people go into the office, the days that people are commuting, are probably, it looks like, going to be concentrated kind of on this core Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday part of the week, with the consensus being pretty clear that Friday is probably going to be the least likely day to have, a large percentage of your workforce on site. And so this has implications for, a variety of things: traffic congestion, transit ridership, and it will present a concern, I think, if we have, the people who are still going into the office, all going in on the same days during the same part of the week, potentially making, those days in terms of traffic congestion even worse than they were, pre-pandemic. I'm going to touch on sort of one main finding. This is the title page off of the report commissioned by the Baker administration, the stage report put together by McKinsey. That did a lot of modeling of future scenarios, looking at different industries and different occupations and different aspects of our economy and how that's expected to kind of pan out, post-pandemic. But what they did that I want to dig in on a little bit more, which is something at MAPC that we've been thinking about a lot, is a lot of information, but really the simple part here is that those yellow circles kind of running down the middle of the plot here, they're estimates of how much we think, from this report and this analysis, what percentage of these different types of, employment sectors, occupations, industries would be likely to go into some form of remote work post-pandemic. It's not the maximum amount where everyone who possibly could starts doing it all the time. It kind of takes into account the fact that not everyone, even if they could, wants to work remotely or wants to work remotely all the time, 5 days a week. And so these are kind of like a nice kind of conservative estimate of these different occupations and where we think in terms of the workforce share is potentially going to be working remotely post-pandemic. Now you add all of these up because these are sectors that are more likely to have white collar workers. They're more likely to have white and higher income workers. But there are also sectors that do make up a large percentage of our regional workforce and our statewide workforce. So if you add all these numbers up, multiply those percentages by the number of employees in those sectors, and you get something on the order of a third of the statewide workforce potentially continuing to telework in large proportions. And these are going to impact different aspects of our economy in different ways, depending on where these people live, how much teleworking they do, and which occupations within these industries are the ones that actually end up doing more remote work than others. Now, if you look at where these people live, this is similar to that map that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, looking at the number of employees who are teleworking or working remotely pre-pandemic. And again, you see a lot of the workers in these industries. And this is, these are those numbers added up for municipal level totals for all the industries with the various percentages applied. And you'll see that, in the suburbs and in the outer suburbs, you sort of have this most substantial number, sort of relatively speaking, to the workforce in those locations. But what you see when you look at the actual numbers of people that would potentially be teleworking is that a lot of them actually live in the core. And while it may be a lower percentage of the entire workforce of the city of Boston, we're still talking potentially about tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people in these already dense inner core communities, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, et cetera, and the inner suburbs as well, that work in these jobs that have a very high potential for continued teleworking at some capacity. And so the implications of this are going to be somewhat different than if it was only the people out in the distant suburbs who were potentially no longer driving long distances, or maybe heavily focused on commuter rail ridership. The impacts are going to be felt sort of throughout the transit system, throughout the road network system. And what we expect to see in terms of changes to vehicle miles traveled and transit ridership is going to depend heavily on where these people, who decide to carry on teleworking in large amounts, where they live. So there are some upsides. There's possible, a redirection of, increased demand and economic, vitality in town main streets, and some opportunities there to try to build local infrastructure. But there's also a tremendous amount of uncertainty on the other side of the coin. What would that mean for urban centers and downtowns in terms of demand for commercial office space, demand for spending on amenities in downtowns like recreation and retail. And the second major concern really is that a lot of the survey data is telling us that drive alone commuting is expected to be higher than it was pre-COVID, which was already too high considering the state of congestion on our roadways. And in particular, there's this concern that if we're looking to see a concentration potentially in this sort of core Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday period, that might exacerbate congestion even further. Another takeaway here is that in addition to, the continued need, as there was pre-COVID, to continue implementing policies that disincentivize vehicle commuting, if people are working in a more flexible, some days a week in the office, some days a week not, the traditional transit subsidies, the incentive programs for commuters, either coming from their employers or whether it's just the formulation of monthly passes from the T, will need to adapt to be able to continue to support this sort of flexible, modular, transit commuter who's not necessarily a 5-day a week, 4 weeks a month commuter. So that's something we need to be focused on, trying to improve and make flexible. And another silver lining is that, we did see this positive shift to more people taking active transportation, more cycling, and we saw improvements in cycling infrastructure, during COVID, and we need to essentially consolidate those gains to try to make sure that we don't lose mode share for the active transportation, and continue to expand them, as we've been saying we should all along. Now, there's several sort of very specific sort of to the equity side of things impacts that we're concerned about, in particular around transit ridership, and I'm sure Jared will talk more about these sorts of issues in his presentation as well. But there's a large number of people in the workforce who are not able to telecommute, who are still commuting 5 days a week or more. They need weekend transit service, they need Monday, Friday transit service. And if there's this sort of shift away, from some of the Monday to Friday, AM and PM peak period ridership, the threat of service cuts, that disproportionately affect transit dependent residents and workers, who need transit and who can't telecommute, is a risk that, we're all concerned about. And then similarly, this reduction in potential spending for downtowns has, runs a real risk of putting severe economic damage on, workers, lower income workers, retail workers, and small business owners in these areas. And so a key thing to think about going forward is how we can support, downtowns, and how we can encourage, in the wake of closures, that we don't allow landlords, to allow long-term vacancies, and we try to incentivize making, commercial spaces affordable for, a diverse set of entrepreneurs who want to open businesses in these downtown areas. And going forward, obviously we need to keep our eye on the data that we are using to understand what's happening. We need continued surveys of employers and employees, and we kind of need to see how this shakes out and to see what the quote unquote typologies of teleworking end up looking like. How many people are actually doing this, in large amounts? Does the novelty wear off? Do people, get back to the office and kind of prefer it? And so there's a lot that's still up in the air. We don't expect that anything is going to be sorted out in the next year, and things are going to keep changing. So we have to continue to adapt as we go along. But we know all the same that we have a vision that we think, supports a sustainable region. And that is a series of steps that we can act on now, continuing to encourage that we expand and solidify our public transit system, disincentivization for vehicle miles traveled and CO2 emissions with private vehicle trips, and just an increased accessibility to employment and housing that will allow all of the residents who want to live and work where they want to live and work to do so. And so I'll stop there, and I think I'll pass it back to Lizzie to move on to the next our next speaker.
Thanks so much, Conor. I really appreciate it. I think we are now going to turn to Scott Mullen from A Better City to walk us through some of the work that they've been doing.
Okay, can you hear me? Wonderful. I'm doing a split screen here and just making sure the tech works. Conor, thank you so much. I mean, I'm hearing a lot in your presentation, some of which I'm going to buttress with the research we did on the commuter side. We were very lucky to work with BTD starting at the beginning of last summer, meaning 2020, with some funding from the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge to implement a commuter survey that we did at the back half of August 2020 into the beginning of September. Very robust response rate. We got 4,200 200 responses in that very first cohort, and you'll see that we published the report November 2020. I'll put a link in the chat to all the reports that we'll be talking about today. This project really got a little bit bigger than we expected. It's a pandemic. There's a lot of unknowns, and again, the robust initial response that we got really helped sort of frame the need to do it again. We bookended this with another exact same survey pushed out through the same channels, and again garnered 2,600 responses. There's some differences there, though. You know, when we were doing the August of 2021, we were getting more than 50% of the respondents were from the healthcare industry. Not surprising, they were commuting at the time, and we didn't really have any interest to promote a commuting survey this past June to that same. They just didn't want to engage, as you can imagine. Some of the things that we were able to learn through this is compare the numbers, right? So we looked at summer 2020, and you can see the breakdown of folks who think they will be teleworking in the future or want to telework. This is the degrees to which they want to. And you'll see 3% not sure, 9% never, 21% all the time. And that's softened as we look ahead another 10 months into the spring 2021. Is the edges are sort of brought down, and the hybrid model really is emerging as what seems most likely, not just through the data, but anecdotally and through interviews that we're doing with key employers, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This has a lot of information. I hope you can see it, but this is the projected mode split. The dark line is before the pandemic, what were you doing? And then after the pandemic, how do you plan to commute to work? And so you can see the big number here is a 15 percentage point jump in drive alone. Clearly that had a lot of people very, very nervous. And that again has softened down by 10 percentage points in the most recent. It's still 5 above where it was, but that's something to be concerned about when you think about us being sort of top of the heap, right? Worst traffic in the nation, 2 years running prior to the pandemic. We can't go back to that. One interesting thing about the subway bus people that were coming out of those modes, when we checked what they were going into, a large proportion of them, both from bus and subway, were going to the more elastic modes of biking, walking, and telecommuting, right? So those are able to snap back quite easily once comfort with transit gets returned. And so the trends here are positive from a mode shift perspective. Transit sentiments as well. You can see we asked a lot of the questions in our survey that were in line with the Ride Safer campaign, what the T was actually doing, running more service to increase social distancing on the buses, mask requirements, upgraded ventilation. They were putting out that great visualization of how air flows through their vehicles so people could get a sense of what to expect. And all of those numbers have increased again in the second round of this commuter portion of the survey. And my screen is a little blocked, but you can see here that the carrot of a reduced or free MBTA pass is real for nearly half of the folks, saying, yes, this would incentivize me to not drive and to come back to transit or to remain on transit. So we're working with a lot of our partners through our transportation management associations to explore this, to talk about subsidies for the companies that might not be doing it so far. And this is huge. The potential for cycling and other forms of micromobility. These results are from the second survey, but I will say from the first one, we were surprised as well. 0 to 5 miles and 6 to 10 miles cumulatively last August and September was 66+%. So that's 2/3 of commuters live very, very close to where they work. 5 miles is a viable bicycle commute, 10 miles is a viable e-bike commute, actually a quite easy one. And so when you fast forward to this most recent survey, 73%, that is a massive number, and that's well within the MBTA footprint. We've got, as Conor said, a growing network of safe on-street facilities that encourage people to get out and try different modes, distanced modes. The shared streets sort of statewide effort that MassDOT was funding with some grants, the Healthy Streets initiative that put miles and miles of safe separated cycling facilities into downtown Boston and all around the city, actually. That's huge. And this reconfiguration of space when there was a reduction in traffic is something, as Conor said, we really need to lean into. We cannot lose the ground that we've gained because it's the public right of way, and we have mostly cars prior to the pandemic because that's really all we built for and made feel relatively comfortable. And so we need to stick with this. And we see here the attitudes towards bicycle commuting also went up from 42% last summer to 57% comfortable with cycling over the next 2 to 3 months. I think a lot of this is driven by the infrastructure gains that we've made, and they're continuing to accelerate. So sandwiched in between those two commuter surveys is a deep dive that we did with 11 area employers of varying size and sector. We didn't want to be, skewed one way to eds or meds or finance or anything. We really did as comprehensive as we could in these 11 interviews. And again, I'll share links in just a minute. And this is to figure out, okay, well, here's what your employees said. Now, what are you actually doing? What policies are you putting in place to support this? Do you agree with this? What are your concerns coming out of this pandemic? And I think what was pretty loud and clear is the return to the office will be hybrid to start. And that's how it's playing out. This report was published in early June, when everybody thought sort of September was when things would really start accelerating in terms of coming back into the office. Obviously, Delta has thrown that for a little bit of a loop, but I think there's general consensus that this is going to be hybrid, whether it's by time of day, flexible schedules, or days per week. Downtown offices in our research will remain, but they will be reconfigured. We weren't seeing. Even in the depths of the pandemic, we were seeing a sort of holding steady. Leases weren't going anywhere. These are long-term commitments, and people were sort of trying to see their way through this. We're seeing from our commercial real estate partners talking about mid to high 90% rents being paid every month, and the flight wasn't really happening. But there will be a reconfiguration. And it might support that hybrid model, right? Where we have sort of maybe open concept, more like a co-working space. De-densification is a term that we learned in this research. And that's where your workforce net number doesn't change, but the square footage per person does, and that goes up. And so where you have people coming in flexibly, whether it's by cohort, by job function, by site, there's going to be some sort of blend that's worked out. Intra-company blend. And it's interesting to note, some of the conversations we had where not every company was measuring their sort of capacity, their utilization of their offices before the pandemic, but those that were said, we were never 100% anyway. We were usually somewhere in the 60 to 65% range, and Fridays were usually sub 50%. And so this isn't that much of a stretch. It's a culture change, but operationally might not be as much of a stretch as we thought. Hybrid work models, this is a potential pitfall. We spoke to one company that said, I have 200 employees, I have 100 parking spots. We used to have competition for those spots, and it was tense. Now we're going to come in on a flexible schedule and everybody gets to park. And, I get it, right? Like from that one company's perspective, but if we blow that out through the region and everybody does that and things like that, we're going to be right back where we started. And so we've been advocating for a sort of flattening of HR benefits. It used to be that a cyclist would get $25 a stipend for their bike ride for maintenance, and then someone else would get a free parking spot. That is not at all equitable distribution of benefits. And a lot of companies are now realizing that. And it's exciting to see those conversations move forward. Another potential negative that we uncovered is, what does this do to my monthly pass, right? Am I going to do my Zone 5 commuter rail pass when I know I'm only coming in 2 days per week? For the employee, that doesn't necessarily make sense. And from the employer, everyone's thinking, what do we do about this? And we will talk about a tool that we built to help shed a little bit of light and data on that in just a second. But finally, active transportation is poised, right? Now, we talked about the proximity of where people work to where they live, talked about the burgeoning infrastructure network that will support active transportation. And talking to these employers, they were reporting, more than half reported either robust or overcapacity use of their bicycle parking facilities. And so a lot of them are currently working to expand parking right now, which we all know there is a dearth of in downtown Boston. There's just not enough racks to park bicycles, and we need to expand that. So one of the things that we heard, this is just quick, I'm going to talk about a couple of tools that we built. One of the things that we heard was real concern, right, from employers saying, when are we going to come back? Well, it's going to be triggered. We're not even going to talk about it until the vaccines are here. Well, now they are. And then we'll talk about it. I think it was vaccines. And then childcare was another big one, which we may touch on, but that's a really big topic. But safety of transit, there's a perception that transit is unsafe, and it's where spread happens, and we really wanted to try to add a little bit of data to this. So we took the statewide data from Massachusetts and Rhode Island within the footprint of the MBTA service area, and offered both the one-shot and the fully vaccinated data. This is updated every Thursday from the state, and our map is updated every Friday morning. You can see in the top left, that's Woburn, chose it randomly. When you mouse over, it tells you the 72% have had a single shot, 66, almost 67 are fully vaccinated, just to help inform the conversation. This isn't going to be the be all end all, but it does help add a little bit of data here. And finally, this is something we've been working with a broad group, a coalition of business groups and TMAs and others that are interested to sort of figure out the future of the commute. And we all agree there needs to be some sort of calculator. And we sort of pooled our resources and brains and decided to move ahead with this. You can select your zone of travel. If you get a transit subsidy, input the percentage. If you get a pre-tax benefit, which means through the PERC program, and this will give you the real cost. And essentially 1.8, you'll see this is a zone 4 with a 35% subsidy by the employer, 25% pre-tax discount, 1.8 commutes per week. And this the cost of the pass is covered. So it really helps, again, add some data behind this. So we're not just going on gut, right? We're actually going on data. And this is helpful not only to the person buying their own pass, but to the HR director saying, well, we're giving 25% now. If we bump that to 35, what does that do to the overall value proposition? And then can we justify removing the parking benefits that we've been giving people during the pandemic as a temporary measure? How do we sort of balance that to make sure that we're getting the outcomes that we want? There's a lot here. I'm sure we're going to hear about it in the Q&A, but I would like to pass it back to Lizzie now. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Molly. It's always great to hear your presentation. I know some folks have asked if you could drop a link to that calculator in the chat. I think that would be helpful. And for those of you who are asking, I'm pretty sure we can make slides available after this and we can send them out to folks with good links as well. Next, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague and former MAPC board member, Jared Johnson from Transit Matters. Jared.
Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and thanks MAPC for putting this on. Really always appreciate the the thoughtful reports and the events that you all put on. But yeah, jumping in and really echoing what Scott said and what Conor said. We've really got to think differently and in terms of how we meet this challenge. One of the things that has been really clear is that traffic is back. Both anecdotally and from all of the data. The highway administrator from MassDOT, has said that for all intents and purposes, the traffic is back, and in some cases it's even worse in certain areas, and in some areas there, folks have said, well, the traffic seems to be flowing slightly better, but what happens, where we're at is that we're really at a point where there's so little slack that just the slightest accident can have really bad traffic snarls. And I think also something to point out is that, there's been a lot of talk about, are folks coming back to the T, and the T does have a, ways to go to get back to sure financial footing. But, I always want to point out that 46% of the T's ridership is not nothing. And I think, especially, given the point that we are with offices not all the way open yet, I think that's still pretty impressive. But again, going back to the traffic point, I think it shows that even if remote work becomes more prevalent and becomes something more permanent, clearly, as a lot more folks are working from home than probably will be in the future, that still has not led to a decrease in traffic. And I think what that points to is that upwards of about 85% of a family's weekly trips are not actually work related. And then there are some ways in which the typical commute actually, or not having a typical commute actually increases traffic, and just think about, the example of a parent, going to pick up their child's medicine at the pharmacy that's right around their job, and they do that during lunch. And then they go to pick up, flowers for their partner. And then on the way back, maybe from the commuter rail station, when they drive back home, they're going to pick up that child. And in a work from home environment, those could be, depending on timing, those could be 3 entire separate trips. So that's another thing to really keep in mind. And then, of course, as Conor mentioned, there are still so many industries where remote work is just not going to be possible. Folks in a lot of our service sector, and so that's something we've got to keep in mind. And I call it making sure that we avoid the Wall-E scenario. And I think none of us would want our vibrant main streets and communities to be replaced by big box stores and to be supplemented by Amazon delivery drones and things like that. And I think that also leads to a larger point around that some of these that again, in the same way that that working remotely can turn into multiple trips. The same thing with some of the innovations and the things that have really grown, online shopping and food delivery apps that have really taken off during the pandemic. Those can actually lead to increases in traffic in our communities. And so looking at how are we setting aside pickup and drop off zones, and how are we thinking about what role TNC, transit network companies, Uber and Lyft, and food delivery apps, what role are they playing in really mitigating and paying for the traffic that they generate? And I think part of this goes to, this was when MassDOT released their Future of Transportation report back in 2019. Even before the pandemic, they were talking about this shift. The first shift that a lot of the transportation industry agencies underwent was, really embracing the idea that we should be moving people and not just cars. And the next thing that MassDOT was really pointing to was looking at, how are they moving from just thinking about moving someone from point A to point B, but thinking about mobility and access, both in literal mobility, but also in social mobility, socioeconomic mobility. And I think this is really the key point, the really key point that we've got to talk about. And I think, sort of putting this all together, how do we reconcile this? What does all of this mean? Picking up off of what the governor said in a sort of a state of the state address around transportation and around sort of the future of work. He talked about multiple centers of gravity, and I think we've got to reconcile that in terms of, why is it easier, to go from Boston to New York than from Boston without a car, than to go from the core neighborhoods of Boston to many of the suburban office parks. That's a major issue that, is a traffic generator in terms of it just forces folks to get cars, even if they don't want to. And then it locks certain folks out of economic opportunity. And I think the same thing is true in getting from some of our gateway cities from one another. RTAs that aren't properly funded, and that don't have routes that stretch in between the different RTA zones. And then also really this refocus on local economies, that if it is true that we are likely to have fewer people commuting to work, again, as I talked about those trip generators, how do we then make sure that our smaller towns, our suburbs, have non-car options, have active transportation options that allow folks to do those daily tasks without having to get into a car. And I think we saw some really promising pilots in communities with shutting down streets and having open streets and having neighborhood streets where folks where kids could play, and you were having block parties, that sort of thing, and setting aside space that was typically for parked cars that now were new bike lanes to accommodate the fact that you did see a huge increase in the number of folks getting around or commuting by bike. And so how do we make that permanent? I think one of the good things is that, MassDOT has had that shared streets grant and has been investing in that. But how do we expand on that? And then also, how do we make sure that that's going to, to gateway cities and to some of our lower income cities that don't have the planning capacity to always take advantage of those grants? And so what is the state doing to make sure that those communities have access to it? And I think the other point to mention too is to make sure that we're still investing in the T. That again, even if the T ridership is roughly about half of what it was pre-COVID, that doesn't mean that it needs half of our attention, and certainly doesn't need half of our half of the resources. The state of good repair backlog, all of these maintenance issues that the T had before the pandemic, those haven't gone away magically because the pandemic is there. And if anything, this is the opportunity to really invest and to really get a lot of that maintenance done while ridership is lower. And it also points to, as Conor mentioned, that really where the T has seen a significant increase a significant resurgence of the previous ridership is during those off-peak times. The T did not have weekend service on a lot of the lines until from roughly, I think it was March of this year until July, and within a month to a month and a half, that service was already back up to about 85% of its ridership. And so what that really shows is that where folks are coming back is in the off-peak hours, so the midday, the late evenings, and on weekends. And so really making sure that we have the resources, we have the operators to drive the buses, operate the trains, to make sure that we can have more consistent headways throughout the day, so that we don't have the same peaky service that responds to the fact that folks are going to be coming into the office later, working later, and to serve the people who quite frankly were being left behind under the previous operating model that had tons of trains for a handful of hours, and then had folks wait on platforms or bus stations for long periods of time in the middle of the day. I also think it's about equitable transit-oriented development. As Mullen pointed out, the business community, the development community, there was a small breather there while there were work restrictions. But since then, we've seen, I'm sure all of you have seen, the cranes are back in the sky, the buildings are going up, and there have been some shifts of what was going to be residential or hotel to office, but by and large, most of the residential developments are still going up. And while there was a small softening of rents last summer, we've not seen this sort of hollowing out of the city that we've talked about. And so we have to rededicate that political will to doing transit-oriented development, because we know that's what gets folks. We know that's what gets folks back on the train and back on buses, and really making sure that we're also talking about equitable transit-oriented development, so that we are making sure that we're providing housing for low and moderate income families next to transit, because again, we know that those are the folks most likely to use transit. And then I think the final point is that really thinking about carbon emissions and climate change, that nothing about COVID has really changed the reality on climate change. And if anything, we're just we're now a year and a half, 2 years further into that timeline that we've talked about. And so this really speaks to investing in active transportation and making sure that we give folks those other options, and making sure that we're talking about the need to push beyond automobility, regardless of what's in the hood or under the floor plate, because we've still got we still have the concern about roads, that constant expansion of roads in order to deal with traffic isn't green, again, no matter what's powering the car, and still looking at issues like particulate matter, where upwards of 80% of particulate matter doesn't come through the tailpipe. And so again, I think it's really about making sure that we give folks options, and that we are pushing beyond automobility. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. I love how passionate you are about transportation and transit. It's always excellent to hear. So we have had some questions that came in from folks in the chat, and we got some questions ahead of time. So I'm just going to facilitate a panel discussion for the next, almost 15 minutes. And I tried to kind of group things together. So if you don't hear your exact question, it's because I'm trying to kind of put a lot of ideas together in one. So yesterday, the Senate Committee on Reimagining Massachusetts released their very first report documenting some key policy changes that we need to have in order to expand economic opportunity, address racial inequity, improve quality of life. They address transportation accessibility, but they also talk about digital divide, childcare, a lot of the things that many of you have brought up today. So I'm curious if you could talk about some investments and policy changes that need to happen, particularly in order to address equity and really serve those who previously have been the most hindered from accessing economic opportunity. And then as you're talking about that policy ideas, I'm curious if you feel like there are ways to use investments from ARPA, the local recovery dollars that came through the recovery bill that was passed, and potentially set us up for the use of federal infrastructure dollars. Big question. Any of our panelists want to jump in?
Well, I think a really exciting opportunity to jump on this is with buses, and I think we're really glad to see that the T is working on their bus network redesign, which is potentially going to be a total blank sheet reimagining of the bus network, which largely resembles the old streetcar network. And so, one of the great things about buses is they have that flexibility. And so, I think long term, we should look at, other expansions to the subway network. One of the big things Transit Matters talks about is regional rail and transforming our commuter rail network into something that, much more resembles a subway network and operates more frequently and longer. But in the short term, making sure that we have direct connections from, say, Roxbury to the seaport, to Logan Airport, and opening up job access there. So, I think that's a huge opportunity. And, even though buses are, relatively low cost, there is still some cost. And so one of the things we've got to make sure that that the Commonwealth is ready for is to use those ARPA dollars for new bus garages, because that is one of the real limiters to expanding bus service and to really modernizing our bus fleet. Is we have garages that are, really, in some cases 20, 30 years, 40 years past their prime. And so that to me sticks out as one of the most immediate things we could do to really, improve access to jobs for low-income folks, and a good use of the ARPA dollars. And one other good sort of positive thing that I'll point out, that's from the early stages of the T's bus network redesign program, is looking at now very few bus routes go into the Longwood Medical area. And right now the T in their sort of initial, and I'll put this in the chat, the T's initial sort of draft of the high frequency bus lines where bus routes where the service would be every 15 minutes or better all day long. I think it's about 4 or 5 of them actually converge or go through the Longwood Medical District. So again, I think it's about identifying, not only what are the key job centers of today, but what are the key job centers of tomorrow, and making sure that we give folks, ideally a 1-seat ride, but if not a 1-seat ride, an easy transfer, from low-income and environmental justice communities into these job centers of today and tomorrow.
If I could jump in, I mean, yes, what Jared just said, and what it has me thinking of, in the last week or two, I started doing some rough numbers, right? So I used to work with Hubway, which is now turned into the Blue Bike, bike share system here in Boston. It is a world-class bike share system. 3,500 bicycles, I think, 350 stations. It's expanded beyond its original footprint of the city of Boston only out into 8 or 9 communities at this point. It is a success. It is also incredibly overtaxed. It's not big enough. It needs to be expanded. It took 7 years just to get to the southern parts of Boston, Dorchester and Mattapan, right? 7 years to expand down there. And the station footprint is anemic at best, right? So if we're talking about what could funding be used for? Well, maybe if we go double the system, that's like 30 million bucks for capital cost and 5 years of operations, right? That is a pittance compared to roadway construction and all the other big capital projects being envisioned. And I would even go further and say we need to go to 1,000 stations and really serve the region as a robust, connected and vibrant network. And that's about 75 million bucks. Based on my rough math, it could be a few years outdated, but this is the way we should be thinking, you know, is dollar invested to the impact that comes out the other end. And I think looking at trail development, looking at on-street infrastructure for bike and bus, and looking at bike share systems, it's public transportation. It is real transportation. And we really need to lean into it. And it really doesn't cost that much in comparison.
Thanks. So I think we might have time for this one last question. And I feel like it's kind of an overarching theme of the conversation that we've been having today. We really need to get people out of their cars, and sort of like the simplest way to do this is by having a strong and robust transit system with good bike networks that kind of run alongside that are safe, and then affordable homes that are near transit. But lots of people who could afford it have moved to the suburbs during the pandemic, and many of them are still working from home. What do we do? Do we just change our TOD and transportation planning approach? Do we wait for downtowns to bounce back? Do we transform commercial real estate into housing? How can we assure some choice riders that transit is really safe and it's time to get back on the train? What do we do with this new normal?
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead, Conor.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the T has been doing that I think is good, we just want to see it expanded and want to see more of it, is the information around just, again, how safe the T is. That, you know, I mean, across the world, there have not been COVID clusters linked to transit. That in all of my experiences on the T, I'm seeing upwards of 90% mask compliance, you know, and that the ventilation in a bus or a subway car is, you know, better than I think most, you know, better than most, you know, whether it's a grocery store, you know, a shop or a restaurant. So I think that is key. But I also think, again, I think it's both. It's, you know, it's making sure that folks know that the T is safe, and again, it is investing in that, in the off-peak service, you know, so that if they're not using it to commute, then they know that it's an option if they want to go into town for whatever recreational other opportunities. But it's also about investing in that local infrastructure as well. You know, as I can't remember if it was Conor, I think it was Conor pointed out that, you know, most trips are, you know, 2 or 3 miles, even a lot of work trips. And so it's giving folks those options, you know, to ride their bike. And I think as excited as folks are about, you know, autonomous vehicles, which I think are, you know, I'm quite bearish on them. I don't think that it's coming anytime soon, but I'm really excited about e-bikes and e-scooters. I think that is the real transportation innovation. You know, I think the amount of, you know, the how far you can go with those, and how they really lower the barrier for folks who, you know, either just aren't interested in showing up to the office drenched or just whatever else, how they're able to really expand the range, I think is really cool. And, you know, I think for all the talk about, you know, cycling being something that's just for the city, you know, we look at how popular rail trails are out in rural areas. You know, one of the areas I point to all the time is, you know, is looking at how folks get around in Holland or in Japan. You know, these are rural areas, and folks get around on bikes or e-scooters, you know, including, I've seen, you know, elderly women, and they'll be biking 30 miles. So, you know, it is possible. to have active transportation solutions in small cities and in more rural areas. This is not just something that's just for Boston.
Yeah, I'll agree with everything that Jared there mentioned, and kind of I just want to underscore the point he made initially, which is, you know, it's easy to get sucked in when we think about the future of remote work with the model that we're sort of looking backwards at, which was like people get up and they go to the office, and there's this like office worker, the commute. You know, when you think about traffic on the Pike, you think it's commuters commuting in, but people are driving on the Pike for 100 different reasons at all different times of day and night. And we have this sort of, you know, focus on just like the AM and PM commute. That's still a problem for the people who have moved out. And as was touched on, you know, if you didn't want to go pay downtown parking garage prices 5 days a week, maybe you're willing to pay it 2 days a week or 3 days a week. So we have to target, you know, the pricing of parking, and we have to incentivize, you know, the transit ridership for those, you know, now new suburban commuters to try to keep them on the commuter rail as opposed to the Pike. And then on the other side of it, that other 80% of trips, 75% of trips, it's what Jared was talking about. You know, how do you get them out of their car for the trip to the grocery store to pick up the kid at school? And how can we use this as an opportunity to maybe revitalize and, you know, urbanize some of our suburbia a bit to make it more attractive, so that you aren't having people lured, you know, to make 30-minute, 40-minute drives, you know, just to go to the grocery store or to go buy something in a big box.
Here. I think all I would add is on the bicycling point is we've proven these things work and people want to ride them. When they don't ride them, it's because they don't feel safe, right? This is an infrastructure problem. We've built for cars. We have cars, right? Simple. So let's build for something else. To Jared's point about the MBTA, I would say that the T is wearing ruby slippers right now. They just need to click their heels. It's called Zone 1A, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a single, in most cases, a single trip, a one stop from a close-in station that will get you, instead of Malden Center, you know, 3 or 4 stations down to North Station. You hop on and it's the same, it's $2.40. You get to North Station in about 7 minutes, right? And so we have the network of Zone 1A stations. We have depressed ridership on the commuter rail. It is the least performing of all the MBTA services right now. So there's space, there's empty seats coming into Boston from Zone 1A, and that's Chelsea, that's Malden, that's West Medford, Porter, all the way around. And when you think about service changes that they've made, JFK UMass is a Zone 1A station. 59 trains used to go right through there in the morning, and people commuting up from the south would have to then take a red line back down. Those trains stop now. Ruggles has 55 additional trains. The Fairmount line has 8 new trains that go to every single stop on there, and Malden Center has 7. So let's lean into that. That's something that we can do right now.
I want to take a second and thank our panelists so much for your thoughtful presentations. There were so many really interesting questions that came up before the when folks registered for this, and there was like almost like a second conversation happening in the chat. I think we might try to round up some of these questions and see if we can get our panelists to weigh in and offer thoughts. We will send back out some slides and links to all the reports. There are many reports mentioned in the chat, so we'll make sure to send all of those out as well. Thank you all so much for coming today. We obviously should have made this an hour and a half, and we know that as we continue to talk about the future of work. And we hope you'll join us again as this conversation continues. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you.